When it comes to the history of cinema, the horror genre has always been a recurring and intriguing one. Throughout history, it has always made impact in society itself and allows us as an audience to question our own stereotypes. Often in the horror genre, there is a continued use of stereotypes in horror, centered around different individuals or groups. Particularly in the horror genre, there is often sexualization or victimization of female characters, portrayed as either helpless or punished often violently for their sexual promiscuity. However, within the film Scream, we see that the film, instead of conforming to gender tropes, it subverts them. Throughout this film, we will be discussing why the horror slasher Scream defines gender stereotypes. In the film Scream, the director Wes Craven consistently goes against stereotypes and representations, as well as using them. From right at the start of the film, we already see as the audience that it's set in a house, which is often shown to the audience as a symbol of comfort and security, as this is normally the safest a person can be in. This is the stereotypical setting, as it's used in horror films to often frighten the audience that such a safe place can be broken into, which therefore plays on the audience's fears right at the start. The character Casey is dressed in white clothing to represent the innocence of the character, a trait often associated with damsels in distress. She is also fully clothed, which goes against the stereotypes of most females in films being scantily clad. The character then repeatedly gets phone calls from an unknown caller, with her becoming more and more frustrated to the point where she now becomes scared when the killer reveals he can see her. This again plays on the audience's fear, something that the director uses to his advantage to frighten us with, that a place of security has been breached, which terrifies the audiences and forces them to emphasize with Casey as she becomes more terrified. The reveal of Casey's boyfriend being tied to a chair goes against the stereotype, as it would appear to the audience that Casey has come to save Steve and not the other way around. The clothing on Steve, however, shows a popular representation in horror films of the typical jock. However, he is tied to a chair and terrified, which shows to the audience who clearly has the power over the other, and terrifies the audience as the jock character is known for being resilient, so makes the audience wonder what type of person the killer is. When Steve gets murdered, it takes any hope of rescue or comfort for Casey, who then gets chased by the killer Ghostface. The chase comes to the point where she almost gets to the safety of her parents, only to be stabbed and dragged away, with her parents hearing her sobs and breathing. Another stereotypical use in this is the phallic representation, showing the audience that the killer has power over her and suffers a brutal death. A defined stereotype of women being weak in horror films. This inclusion of the parents and the voice of a terrified mother makes the audience emphasize with the terror of losing a child and what kind of person could do this. Casey's white clothing stained with blood symbolizes the purity of herself and shows direct contrast to Ghostface, who is clothed in black, symbolic to a villain, which shows another stereotype of villains wearing dark clothes and being mysterious. However, Wes Craven goes against the stereotypes again, as there is hardly ever use of the male gaze. The main character Sydney is even given a unisex name, and shown in a heroic way, which in horror film history begins the horror trope of the final girl representation, which is the female survivor being heroic and neutral as a character. Wes Craven repeatedly moves back and forth with representations and stereotypes, so as not to give the audience a specific prejudice for certain characters. Every girl in the film has some sort of contrast. Casey is an innocent girl but defies the stereotype of promiscuous woman dying first. The character Tatum wears slightly revealing clothing but has a unisex name like Casey and Sydney and fights back in any scene, as well as Gail Weathers, who nevertheless, despite the stereotype of being a mean girl, still holds a kind nature and fights back. For example, in the scene between Sydney and Ghostface, shows again the back and forth of stereotypes. A wide variety of shots are used in this scene, as the camera is using equipment to facilitate movement. As is in this scene, Sydney receives a phone call from the killer, and finds him in the house, which then ends in a fight and chase. It starts with close-ups so it ensures the audience can see a surprise at getting a phone call, so they know what might possibly happen to her. Then a wide shot with focus pulling so to show the background of what could possibly be a safe environment. Then back to Sydney with a zoom to show her expressions again. The camera repeatedly pans to show her going towards the door so as to raise the attention of the audience, as they know the killer could possibly be there for their attention to lower through Sydney's point of view, to show that there is nothing there to the audience, therefore calming their expectations down. This scene again raises the audience expectation and fool them into believing something actually happened, a trait Wes Craven repeatedly uses to play with our minds. The camera then focuses back to Sydney in a mid-shot to show the scene and Sydney coming to the camera closer to then become a medium close-up to show a continued phone call. When she gets back to the house, it then uses an over-shoulder shot with focus pulling on Sydney again, so she doesn't see the killer behind her in the house, frightening the audience with a jump scare. This use of shot terrifies the audience as we can immediately see the danger whereas Sydney cannot, which makes us feel terrified for her. This then again plays with our minds as there is now a danger when we least expect it. This film then proceeds to follow the action with a Steadicam or a shoulder mount to make it seem as one smooth take so as to follow the action. The use of a slow angle to show the killer's threatening position allows the audience to view Sydney as weak, which then again plays to the big stereotype of a girl being a weak character. The shot then changes in a mid-shot to show a chase scene with Sydney escaping Ghostface and barricading herself away for Ghostface to suddenly leave, which then lowers the tension as the danger is gone, only for it to be raised again when Billy comes. This filmmaker uses this variety of shots to raise the audience's fear of the killer only to let them down, lowering their guard so they can react more easily to the fear of the killer. This use of camera following Sydney around makes the audience emphasize with her as they understand her fear better. When Sydney runs to the front door, the camera focuses on a close-up zoom on the killer's mask outside the house, which scares Sydney and the audience as they can relate to a fear which then reveals to be a police officer. This use of shot to reveal the threat of the killer only for it to be the exact opposite, which is a police officer and the trusted friend of Sydney, is humorous to the audience as it shows a close-up of both reactions. This film goes against stereotypes, but comes back to it to show the audience that the characters know that this is a horror film, and repeatedly uses this throughout the film to play with the audiences as they're unsure of what to expect. In this scene in which the character of Randy repeatedly tells a horror film actress to look around, with the actor himself portraying Randy has ironically the same name, which directly addresses the audience themselves through the cliché of talking to the film screen. The film satirizes the clichés of the horror film genre and confuses the audience to being unsure on who the killer could be. The Wes Craven uses this uncertainty by implying the stereotypical mysterious boyfriend could be the killer, only for him to apparently die, which increases the audience's emphasized fear for Sydney when she realizes it was him all along. This also reinforces another stereotype, with the killer having a motive that was usually traumatizing, which at first gives the audience sympathy for the killer, and subverts it instead through having a second killer with no motive at all, which terrifies the audience. The fact that there are two killers instead of one, as well as a killer with a motive and a killer without one, again shows the back and forth within the stereotypes and plays with the audience's assumption of their characters. The stereotype of lone survivor is even being played on, with both Sydney and Gail surviving, as well as Randy, who reinforces another male stereotype of the geek, due to the fact that Randy is obsessed by horror movies, shown to be intellectual and gets bullied for it. The fact that he survives subverts another stereotype of only one individual surviving, which is the heroic male, and instead focuses on two strong females fighting the villain and saving each other. The film even subverts the chain of gender representation of the survivor, with the main character no longer virgin or innocent and surviving the killer. Scream plays on the audience expectations as well as openly showing clichés that the movie subverts. In conclusion, Scream is a film that changed the horror genre with its subversion of gender tropes, encouraging instead to oppose the portrayal of women in cinema, through the use of both female and male characters as well as challenging the stereotypes of horror. By allowing this, it allows us as the audience not to anticipate the clichés, but instead read the characters themselves, to surprise and intrigue us instead.